commercial banks are not yet there, but multilaterals, ECAs are playing the field at this moment, and this is where their critical role as a catalytic role to really attract both private investors to enter into the market and eventually commercial banks to be able to really finance this project and eventually project bonds as well, and not just depend on multilaterals and ECAs, which are much more at the first phase when there is need for that. So I think these are some of the challenges. Renewable energies, just to answer your question, it's a way to attract foreign investors to large-scale utility auctions by designing and attracting local suppliers and international suppliers. It's just one of the mechanisms that can be used. It's a critical mechanism for ongoing energy auctions to ensure that there is business continuity, which is very important for suppliers, like was mentioned this morning as well. So with that, I'll keep it as short as possible so that everybody has the opportunity to talk and open for questions after. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. And I can just echo your statements on Argentina and the role that having credit support systems really do play a role in getting lenders interested. So, I think that can play a role in other countries as well, even if it's not on a large-scale basis for reverse energy auctions. But having some kind of credit support or something else like that can really help unlock private sector capital. So I'd like to turn it over to David to talk a little bit about integrating renewable energy into the grid, because one of the things that lenders also want to know is, will the utility be able to accommodate all the power that's being introduced, given the variable nature, and that battery storage may not quite be there yet? So would love to hear your thoughts, David.
Thanks, Jason. I want to first say thank you to USAID and to the CEADIR team for organizing this important discussion. I think it's really timely in the market. I had put together a few statistics about the growth of renewable energy, but I think we covered that pretty well this morning. And what I will say is that as countries are, I think countries, developing countries, not just China and India, but an increasing number of developing countries are solving their financing challenges around renewable energy, getting more renewable energy into the grid. The additional challenges around intermittency are really beginning to materialize. And I talked to colleagues operating in India, colleagues operating programs in Vietnam and elsewhere, and to get their sense of what level of what penetration rates for renewable energy do we start to see the challenges around intermittency really materialize for the grid. And they said, in real consultant speak, it depends. But basically the consensus was, in certain localized conditions, renewable energy penetration rates as low as 4 or 5% can already begin to trigger challenges on the grid. And likewise, in other conditions, it might be north, 25% or even 30% renewable energy penetration before you really need to address the challenges around intermittency. But what I think is what's critical then is, as more and more countries approach these, it's really important that grids become, now I think the term, we use the term weak grids, they need to become strong grids, and they really need to harness the flexibility in operations basically from throughout the grid wherever possible. And while many of the solutions for around addressing the intermittency of renewable energy are capital intensive, actually the majority, I think, are really have a heavy service element, a heavy planning element, a heavy markets and structure element, and that creates a real strong opportunity, I think, for services, and in particular for U.S. companies. Some of the service-oriented solutions that we've looked at, market design opportunities, and these are both one-off and recurring opportunities around the creation of ancillary service markets, expanded regional coordination, grid modernization activities. System operation support opportunities are really critical. This includes modernized grid codes that are appropriate for renewable energy generation, RE forecasting, is critical. Balancing and dispatch services, these are also critical. And of course, advisory support, development and deployment around storage, and accessing dispatchable centralized generation. I just want to say a word about one of the other things I was asked to talk about is renewable energy zones. This is something that's increasing, and we've seen it in discussions, again, in India and Vietnam, countries that I'm familiar with, and extensively in South and Southern and Eastern Africa as well. There have been a lot of studies, and I think it's going to be expanded, just like for the same reason that industrial zones and special economic zones, they're addressing challenges in the country that may be difficult to solve at a national level by focusing certain things on certain challenges at a localized level. They can be addressed. And there's also certain economies, of course, that make renewable energy zones particularly attractive. I think the United States has tremendous experience, particularly in Texas, but perhaps elsewhere. And this is a real opportunity for services support in those developing countries that are looking to establish zones. Opportunities in the resource mapping and siting, transmission planning, which is of course critical, feasibility analysis, and procurement and implementation support. There's just a tremendous amount of activities that need to happen concurrently in establishing an effective renewable energy zone. Nobody wants to build transmission until you know that it's feasible. Project developers, until you know that there's a market and that project developers will come, and conversely, project developers want to be assured that transmission will be there so that their energy can be accurately dispatched. Just a couple more points. I think I looked at some statistics. Development banks, they're financing, I think, just in the last quarter, upwards of $3 billion for energy projects. And more than a third of that, and this is really the increasing trend, this is really the trend, is for improvements to the transmission grid. So while the bulk of that is still for new generation, I think upwards of 50%, the real movement is the recognition and the investment and the spurring of public sector investment into improvements to the transmission grid, and that's absolutely critical. And then as a last point, and what you had mentioned, Jason, I think project developers and investors are increasingly looking, and we heard this earlier today, not just at the PPA that they're being offered, but what are the fundamentals in the market? Are they going to be able to credibly dispatch their energy? Is there going to be a risk of curtailment? It's one thing if you have coverage in the PPA. It's far better if you have a well-run grid system that drives the risk of curtailment, towards zero. Take or pay arrangements aren't ideal. They cause a lot of stress on the system, and so instead, having well-operated systems that are taking electricity and channeling it, and are using other flexible options to address the intermittency of renewable is far more critical. And so what's happening is that these developers and investors are, I think, not just assessing their project, and its fundamentals, but they're assessing the market in which it operates. And if those conditions aren't there, if that grid is a weak grid, it's an absolute definite risk factor, as fundamental as currency risk or a host of other risks, political risk, et cetera, that are in that country.
Great, thank you, David. So you spoke a lot about the technical aspects of the project and or the overall system and how to make a functioning energy sector work. But I'd be interested in hearing from Ignacio the regulatory side of this and the policy setting, everything that comes well in advance to make a functioning market. And I understand that you've worked quite actively in the Mexico market, so I'd be interested in hearing that specifically.
Yes, thanks. That's a great question. Yeah, perhaps my view on some of this stuff is a little bit different, and I was like, I think it's more interesting when you have a debate and you discuss some of this stuff. Maybe about background, I started in the early 1980s. I was in the energy department of the World Bank for quite a few years, and then after that I went into consulting. And so I went through the whole process in terms of first from Energy Department World Bank, looking at the whole macro context. We used to talk obviously about vertically integrated public utilities and whether the World Bank was going to give a loan or not, and the parity with the oil prices. So that's how it started. And then in the 90s, I went to the private sector, did a lot of work, and was involved in the IPPs. We used to call it private sector participation in the power sector. That's where I started the process. Starting in the mid-90s, I was involved in leading, actually, with USAID for 10 years in the restructuring and privatization of the power sector in Central America. So we did all the drafting of the laws, the regulations, the unbundling of the utilities, the privatization. For example, there was a comment about Africa and the very low electrification rate. Guess what? How were we able to do sector reform in much of Latin America, and particularly Central America, that I was dealing? It was because through the privatization of the state-owned distribution utility, we call that a capitalization. So Bolivia started, the government used that money as an incentive for the electrification of the country. For example, in Guatemala, before the privatization restructuring, I think the electrification rate was maybe 52% of the population. In 5 years, we reached 95% through the money of the privatization restructuring. So there's many ways, of addressing these issues. Regarding renewable energy, as you can see also from my background, what's very, very exciting, and I tell here to the private industry here, I consider we are in a revolution right now for renewable energy. And why? I didn't start with renewable energy. I started with the policy, the regulatory, the reform, the restructuring, the privatization, the enabling framework. And what is happening differently, which is very much in my portfolio right now, renewable energy is competitive. We didn't even have that really 5 years ago. That is really what is changing the market for everybody here. Now, in that context, what is very interesting, some of the countries have been mentioned here. Actually, I'm surprised South Africa and Brazil, because I think those are kind of the models not to follow. One difference, now you're asking on the policy of regulatory, what's a big difference, let's say, with Brazil and the other countries in Latin America where I've been involved? In Brazil, I was just, a couple of weeks ago with the president of Eletrobras International. So I was telling him, in Brazil, the problem is that the reform goes through 2 or 3 different government administrations. In the other countries in Latin America, we did it all within one administration. In Mexico, wow, those that know are working in Mexico, we know the challenges that we have faced under this current administration to get as much as possible done and established and demonstrated before we have another government, because then it will be very difficult to go back. So in Brazil, basically I said, yeah, the problem, you go 3 steps forwards and then 2 steps back. He says, no, Ignacio, it's not like that. We go 3 steps forward, then 2 steps on the side, and then 2 steps on the left. We do the samba. So this issue, again, answering on the policy regulatory renewable energy, as you see, I'm combining the policy, legal, regulatory, the strategy, and now the competitiveness of the renewable energy. And if we go to the Mexico case, interesting, very little has been mentioned about that. There were a couple, but you know what? We got the lowest prices in the world. It's the most recent large market in the world, 75,000 megawatt, which